She had survived everything. The 6-month crossing, the cholera camp where 3 people in her wagon train died in a single afternoon, the first winter in the sod eye with the ceiling that delivered things in the night, and the wind that did not stop for weeks. She had survived all of it with a particular stubbornness that the frontier selected for, the kind that does not announce itself as courage because it has no alternative available to compare itself against. And now it was time, and the physician who had ridden 4 hours to reach her cabin came through the door still wearing the coat he had worn to the examination he had conducted that morning, the one involving a body that had been dead for 2 days. And he did not stop to wash his hands because the concept of washing his hands as a medical intervention had not yet entered the framework available to him. He approached the bed. He was there to help. He was carrying on the surface of his skin the specific biological cargo that was going to kill her, and neither of them knew it. And there was no one in that cabin or within 4 hours of that cabin who knew it either. Welcome to the raw frontier. Today we are going to a place the camera has always looked away from. Not the gunfight, not the trail, not the gallows or the saloon or the operating table in the surgeon's tent. The bed. The frontier bedroom where the most natural biological event in human experience was, in the specific conditions of the 19th century American West, among the most lethal. You are going to discover what childbirth on the frontier actually involved, what the physician's unexamined hands introduced into the body of a woman at her moment of greatest physiological vulnerability, and what happened in the days that followed when an invisible enemy that medicine had not yet learned to see began its work. The version that cinema offers is warm, and it is resolved, and it takes approximately 90 seconds of screen time. The basin of steaming water. The clean towels that no frontier household reliably possessed. The brief and photogenic period of effort followed by the healthy cry of a newborn and the exhausted but smiling face of a mother who has accomplished something difficult and is now, clearly, going to be fine. The physician, if he appears at all, is competent and calm, and his hands are clean in the way that all hands in films are clean, because film has no mechanism for showing the viewer what is on a surface they cannot see. What was on the physician's hands was the product of medical practice conducted without the bacteriological knowledge that would eventually redefine what medical practice meant. Ignaz Semmelweis had demonstrated in 1847, through careful clinical observation of mortality rates in Viennese maternity wards, that physicians who moved directly from performing autopsies to conducting obstetric examinations without washing their hands were transferring something from the dead to the living that was killing the living at catastrophic rates. The ward staffed by physicians who moved between the morgue and the delivery room had a mortality rate many times higher than the ward staffed by midwives who had no access to the morgue. Semmelweis understood the implication. He implemented hand-washing protocols. The mortality rate in his ward dropped dramatically. He presented his findings. The medical establishment did not accept his findings. He was arguing that physicians were killing their patients, and the medical establishment of the 1840s and 1850s was not an institution prepared to receive that argument with the equanimity of people who prioritize evidence over professional identity. He was dismissed. His protocols were abandoned after his departure from the ward. And the physicians who moved from autopsy to delivery room in the American frontier of the 1860s and 1870s were doing so in a professional culture that had not incorporated conclusions that continued to operate on the pre-bacteriological understanding of disease transmission, which was to say that it operated on an understanding that the specific mechanism of what was happening did not exist. They were not negligent in the sense of knowing and disregarding. They were practicing the medicine their training had given them, in conditions that their training had not prepared them for, with tools that their training had certified as adequate, in a framework that had not yet made room for the information that would have changed everything about how they approached the room they were entering. The woman in the bed did not have the benefit of knowing any of this. She had the benefit of the physician's presence, which in the isolated geography of the frontier homestead represented an improvement over the alternative, which was no medical presence at all. She had the benefit of his experience and his intentions, both of which were genuine. She did not have the benefit of his clean hands, because his hands were not clean in the sense that mattered, and the sense that mattered was the one that nobody in that room understood yet. Puerperal fever, which the period also called childbed fever, is a systemic infection that results when pathogenic bacteria enter the reproductive tract during or immediately after delivery. The delivery process itself creates the conditions for this entry. The tissues that have expanded and thinned and stretched to accommodate birth are, in the hours and days following delivery, an open biological interface between the exterior environment and the interior of the body. And the interior of the body in those hours and days is also recovering from profound physiological effort of delivery, with its immune resources partially diverted to the immediate demands of recovery and the demands of milk production and the demands of an infant requiring nourishment. It is the most vulnerable window in the physical life of a woman who survives to experience it. Into this window, the physician's contaminated hands introduce their cargo. The bacteria did not announce their arrival. The first hours after delivery that had introduced streptococcal or staphylococcal organisms into the reproductive tract were hours of normal postpartum recovery. The exhaustion and the soreness and the tentative physical adjustment to a body that had just done the most demanding thing it would ever be asked to do. The woman rested. The infant was tended. The physician, if he remained, observed what appeared to be a normal recovery. If he had ridden 4 hours to arrive, he may have ridden 4 hours back before the first signs appeared. The fever came first, typically within 24 to 48 hours, not the mild elevation of normal postpartum inflammation, a climbing temperature that the body could not stabilize, that moved through the afternoon and into the evening, and continued moving while the woman's husband placed wet cloths against her forehead and understood that something was wrong in a way that was different from the wrong that the frontier had previously shown him. The wrong that had solutions, or at least responses. This wrong did not offer him a response that connected clearly to a cause he could identify or address. The abdomen changed. The uterus, in normal postpartum recovery, contracts and reduces over days as the tissue returns toward its pre-pregnancy state. In the body fighting a streptococcal infection in the reproductive tract, the abdomen moves in the opposite direction. The inflammation that the infection produces in surrounding tissue is visible from outside the body as a distension that was not present immediately after delivery, and that grows hour by hour with the advancing infection beneath it. The tissue of the uterus and the surrounding structures, overwhelmed by the bacteria proliferating in the warm and nutritionally rich environment that postpartum tissue provides, begins to undergo the changes that infection of soft tissue always eventually produces when it is not interrupted. The smell that accompanied advanced puerperal fever was documented by husbands and attending family members in accounts that reach across the specific language of individual writers toward the same description. The particular sweet organic corruption of tissue that has been overtaken by bacterial processes, contained within a living body that is still fighting to manage an infection it cannot overcome. It was a smell that preceded the outcome in a way that those who had smelled it previously recognized. It was a smell that caused men who loved the woman in that bed to spend the final days outside the cabin, not from indifference, but from the specific and devastating combination of being unable to help and being unable to witness, without cost that the frontier imposed on people it placed in impossible positions. She was conscious through much of this. The delirium that advanced infection produces arrived in waves rather than as a continuous state, and in the intervals between waves she was present in the room and aware of what was happening to her body, and capable of understanding, in a particular clear-eyed way that the frontier produced in people who had spent years developing realistic assessments of their situation, that the direction she was traveling in did not reverse. There was no anesthetic for this. There was no intervention available that addressed the underlying infection, because the underlying infection was invisible in the sense that mattered, the sense of being biological rather than physical, a process rather than a thing, something that the medicine of the period could observe in its effects but could not reach with anything in its toolkit. The physician who returned, if he returned, could observe the fever and reduce it temporarily with whatever the period offered for fever reduction. He could observe the distension and note its progression. He could provide the presence of a professional witness to something he did not have the tools to stop. The mortality rate from puerperal fever in the pre-antiseptic era was not a marginal statistical risk. In hospital settings where Semmelweis's observations were not implemented, it reached and sometimes exceeded 10% of all deliveries. In the frontier setting, where the conditions of delivery were those of isolated homesteads rather than dedicated facilities, where physician access was irregular and midwife availability was similarly constrained, where the available sanitation was what the Saadai or the farmhouse permitted, the numbers are harder to establish precisely and were certainly not lower. 1 in 5 women on the frontier died of pregnancy-related causes. Not 1 in 5 who encountered complications. 1 in 5 who became pregnant. Across the full spectrum of outcomes that pregnancy produced in a population without access to modern obstetric intervention. Hemorrhage, obstructed labor, eclampsia, and infection. The invisible contribution of every unclean hand that entered a space that should have been defended with the knowledge that the period did not yet possess. When the infant was not moving correctly through the birth canal, when the labor that had been progressing reached a point at which progress stopped and the physician's assessment was that progress could not resume without intervention, the intervention available was a forceps. The obstetric forceps, a hinge metal instrument designed to apply traction to the infant's head to assist or complete a delivery that the natural process could not, was not a new invention in the 19th century. It had been in clinical use for nearly 200 years by the time the frontier physician reached into his leather bag for it. The principle behind it was sound. The implementation, in the frontier context, reflected the frontier's general approach to the gap between what was needed and what was available. The forceps a frontier physician carried were the forceps he had. They were iron, typically, in the period before surgical steel became standard, and iron rusts, and a leather bag that transported them was not a sterile environment in any sense that the word sterile implies. The forceps that had been used at the previous delivery had been wiped and replaced in the bag and transported to this delivery, carrying on their surface the biological record of where they had been. They were not boiled. The concept of boiling surgical instruments to render them bacteriologically safe was, like hand washing, a product of the germ theory that the period's mainstream medicine had not yet integrated. They were applied cold, in the sense of ambient temperature, which in a frontier cabin in winter was a temperature that the metal retained efficiently. The application of a cold metal instrument to tissue that was already under the extreme physiological stress of obstructed labor was not an experience that the available analgesia was adequate to manage. The available analgesia was alcohol, in whatever form and quantity the household possessed, administered in the understanding that it would reduce the patient's coherence without reliably addressing the specific nerve pathways, transmitting the information that her body was generating in that moment. The forceps required space to be positioned correctly, and creating that space in a delivery that had already produced significant tissue stress required a manipulation that produced in the patient a response that the people present in the room carried with them for the rest of their lives. The accounts of frontier births that involved forceps, written by husbands or older daughters or neighboring women who attended, are brief in a way that the most overwhelming experiences produce brevity, the language contracting around the event because expansion is not possible. The traction applied to the forceps to complete the delivery was not a precise or measurable force in the way that modern obstetric training and modern instrumentation permit it to be precise and measured. It was a force that the physician judged necessary to accomplish the delivery, applied manually, calibrated by experience and by the feedback the instrument provided, in conditions that were not the conditions under which the instrument's use had been refined. The damage that forceps delivery produced in the frontier context was not exceptional. It was the expected consequence of an instrument applied by a practitioner working at the limit of his tool's suitability and his own ability to use them correctly in those conditions. The infant who arrived through this process, if the infant arrived, entered a world that required immediate attention and that the physician was now attempting to provide while also managing condition the mother, who had been through an experience that her body was registering with every system it possessed. The infant who did not arrive, who could not be delivered by any means a physician had available, required a different kind of decision, one that the period's obstetric practice addressed with the same imperfect toolkit and the same terrible mathematics that the frontier applied to every choice it forced people to make between options that no one would have chosen if other options had existed. The women who died on the frontier died at rates that the historical record establishes clearly and that the cultural memory of the period has not adequately preserved. The gunfighter's death was visible and it was public, and it was conducted in the open air in front of witnesses who wrote about it and told stories about it and eventually made films about it. The death in the bed was private and it was domestic and it was attended by family and occasionally by a physician who had written hours to be present for it. And it was not a story that the culture of the period was structured to receive as history in a way that the public death was history. The women who did not die, who survived delivery and the postpartum period and went on to the next pregnancy and the one after that, did so carrying knowledge of what the bed represented that the men around them did not carry in the same way. They had been in the room. They knew what the basin of water and the clean towels of the cinema version were standing in for. They knew because they had been in that room, and they knew because their neighbors had been in that room and had not come out it the way they went in. The gunfighter chose his risks. He walked to the center of the street with the knowledge of what might be waiting and the option, theoretical at least, of not walking there. The woman on the frontier did not choose the bed. She arrived at it through the biology of marriage and the economics of frontier labor, which required children who could eventually work the claim, and the social structure of a period that did not offer the framework for a different set of choices. She faced what the bed contained not with the dramaturgy of the duel, but with the private and unwitnessed courage of a person doing the thing that has to be done, because the alternative is the thing that does not bear thinking about. The real wild in the Wild West was not on the street at noon. It was in the bedroom at 3 a.m, with the physician's contaminated hands and the iron forceps and the fever that would either break or not break, and the infant who needed everything from a body that had already given everything it had and was being asked to give more. That is where the frontier's true accounting happened. That is where the cost of the next generation was paid, in the specific currency of women, who were never going to be commemorated on a wanted poster or written into a dime novel, or given a moment in a Hollywood film where the camera held on their face and acknowledged what they had done and what it had cost them to do it. What is worse, the duel, where you see what is coming and have some agency over how you meet it, where the moment of reckoning is brief and public and at least contains the possibility of a clean outcome. Or the bed, where what is coming is invisible and arrives after the hardest thing your body has ever done and takes 3 days to complete its work, while the people who love you wait outside because there is nothing inside the room they can do. There is no comfortable answer, and you already know which one you would choose. Leave it in the comments. And if the physician's hands represent the worst that frontier medicine delivered to the most vulnerable moment in a person's life, the same hands held other instruments in other rooms and produced other outcomes that this channel has already begun to document. The lead ball in the tissue, the probe entering the wound, the saw that arrived when infection had made every other option unavailable. Click on our video about gunshot wounds in the Old West. The operating table was waiting for everyone the frontier hadn't finished with yet. Raw, visceral, history. This is the raw frontier.